a great honor to be here at the CCLA. It's an organization that I've admired for a long time. We share a lot of the same values and interests, and I hope that what I have to say may be of interest and of some use above everything, and inspire people to continue on this good work and take it in new directions. Last time I talked in public about this subject, freedom of information, access to information, it was back in February at the Toronto Public Library, one of their branches during Freedom to Read Week. And I had something really spicy to lead off with. It was only the previous day that our federal government had actually embarrassed itself once again in the area of access to information. Somebody in Ottawa had prepared a response to a report by the Centre for Law and Democracy in Halifax, which had said that Canada had slipped to 55th among the nations of the world in its performance regarding access to information. Things like time it took to attend to requests, the number of omissions that it made in attending to requests, and that kind of thing. This was a response that tried to show that, yes, the government wasn't that bad, that in fact they did respond in a timely and complete manner. But there was only one problem. When a reporter from the Canadian Press asked to see the internal memo from one bureaucrat to another about the response that they were going to issue, it actually took the federal government 5 months to release this material. That's 4 months over the deadline set out in the Access to Information Act to release a memo about a response to a report saying that they weren't doing well enough on Access to Information Act deadlines. Well, unfortunately, that's not unique. And in fact, today we have much more hot new material, stuff that's happened just in the past week. Particularly, I wanted to draw attention to the Federal Information Commissioner Suzanne Legault's rather extraordinary statement saying that the RCMP, the organization responsible for enforcing the law in Canada, has been seriously dragging its feet in terms of, guess what, compliance with a law, namely the Access to Information Act. Suzanne Legault is the Federal Information Commissioner, and she is responsible for overseeing government responses to the Act and the administration of the Act in general and its use by Canadians. And she told Global News that people who were filing access requests with the RCMP were being met with complete silence. She said this past year, at some point, the RCMP became an institution that's completely stopped responding. And she also said this is the tip of the iceberg, a symptom of what she called the clear signs of deterioration across the system. She promised to say more in her annual report, which should be out next month. And beyond Canada, of course, we have the ongoing saga of WikiLeaks, all these global information liberators, as I would call them, and their determined efforts to let us know, by means of the release of documents, some of the things our most powerful governments, especially the US, are up to. Including, of course, plans to spy on individuals on a scale that I think has astonished many of us. And again, in the past week, these extraordinary events in Britain, where the partner of the man who engineered the release of Edward Snowden's National Security Agency documents was held incommunicado as a supposed terrorist for 9 hours at Heathrow Airport, and apparently reminded that the transit area was a Guantanamo-style legal black hole where no country's laws actually held sway. And to top it all off, we had Alan Rusbridger, who is the editor-in-chief of the Guardian newspaper, describing how he was forced to allow employees of the British government into his office so they could physically smash computers whose hard drives contained copies of Snowden's leaked documents, as if publishing one of Britain's oldest newspapers, read by millions of people around the world, was some kind of lark. They told him, "You've had your fun, now we want the stuff back." This gave Rusbridger cause to wonder in print how many people truly understood the absolute threat to journalism that's implicit in the idea of total surveillance when or if it comes, and he added, increasingly, it looks like when. So I don't want to stray too far from the topic of Canada's laws, but I do want you, especially here today, to be conscious of a wider context here, that the battle for access for truly open government, if you like, is being fought in. And I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that the advent of digital communication is forcing all of us to choose sides in an information war. I really don't think that's too strong a term. What I mean by that is a battle over how information and knowledge are generated, stored, used, disseminated, and destroyed. Increasingly, the fight to gain access to information collected on behalf of the public and at public expense is pitting citizens against politicians, senior officials in the public administration, and the military. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to separate it from the fight each one of us must carry on to retain control over our personal identity and our information interaction with others. Some people say the boundary between public and private is disappearing. I think it's more accurate to say it's being redrawn, and it's being redrawn in ways that are decidedly unfavorable to civil rights and freedoms. What was private, increasingly and dangerously, is becoming public, and what was public, or at least what ought to be, legally and philosophically, is increasingly being hidden from public view. At the same time, on the positive side, we're starting to see a whole new way of thinking about public information. Not only are people using our access laws and starting to demand better access laws, they're using the tremendous power of digital media technologies to show what can be done to demand information and to organize it, and how it can be used in support of political participation in social action, and also how new ways of gathering and formatting and displaying public information might actually change the relationship between citizens and government. Now in Canada, it seems to me we're pretty well placed to talk about these battles and also to wage them. We are one of the earliest countries to put in place a comprehensive regime of laws and regulations designed to ensure that citizens had a reasonable amount of access to the reams of information collected by their governments, including information about what these governments, the people we elect and appoint and pay to run our city, our province, our country, all of our public institutions, what these governments are doing. The idea has always been that we live in a strong democracy and we need to know what our governments are doing because that's how democracies work. We elect them and a few years later we get to vote again and we think they've done a good job, we let them continue, and if not, we throw them out. And we can't make those choices without knowing what they've been up to. So of course we should know what they're doing with our money and our support. I'll talk about some of the ways this is happening. First, I want to talk briefly about what information is, because I think there's sometimes a lot of confusion, especially now when we hear a lot about big data. And some people, I think, there's a danger of confusing terms such as data, information, and another term that I'll talk about in a minute, which I think is perhaps even more important. Data is information on the most basic level. For example, there are 35 million people in Canada. Anne Murray was born in Spring Hill, Nova Scotia. Sidney Crosby scored 215 goals up until 2010 when he was injured. Now those facts, sometimes they could be suspect, but we have reliable statistical agency, reliable information collectors, a certain degree of honesty in public life. We tend to be able to agree on those things. We trust the NHL to keep good records. And since games are played in public before thousands of people, a lot of money, both fantasy and real, rides on this data. If the NHL didn't keep good records, well, somebody else would. Well, let's just stay with Crosby for a moment. And I've used this example before. What about another kind of information? Not only how many games did he play before he was interested, a data point like that. But what about his health after he was injured? Did people who were interested know everything they might have known about that as early as they might have known it? Was everyone who knew what was going on frank and forthcoming about the possible consequences? Perhaps not. And this is different from data, this kind of information. When information consisting of gathered and organized data, a record of events, of observations of many kinds, is processed and analyzed, it becomes something else. It becomes knowledge. It becomes interpretation. And this is really what's the key, I think, to the way we decide policies and how our society is going to move forward. If you look at the major political debates, they all revolve around the way that information is transformed into knowledge. The economy. When we debate economic policy, we're not normally arguing about the facts, the unemployment rate, the balance of trade, and so forth. It's how they should be interpreted and what the best policies are, given what we know. Same with lots of other policies. And the thing about knowledge is that different people and different institutions and organizations have an interest in creating. Companies, unions, nonprofit organizations, associations, people of all kinds, they create it for their own purpose, and so do governments. They take information, which in most cases they have more of than anyone else, and they transform it into knowledge for their own purposes, bureaucratic purposes and political purposes. The difference with this government-created knowledge is that we pay for it. Not only is it collected at public expense, the crunching and analyzing and strategizing based on it is also collected, is also done at public expense for ostensibly public purposes, purposes of developing public policy, by people who are specialists and are trained to do this and have, or are supposed to have, our collective public interest in mind. So information, when I talk about information, I want you to think about not just data and statistics, things we can agree on, things that are quantifiable and verifiable, but also the options that are available, the things that are being considered, the deliberations that are going on, what isn't done, what wasn't done, what was rejected as a potential policy, as well as what is being done. To do that properly, you have to look at what's left out of the equation and the projections and so on, as well as what's put in. Government officials tend to think that kind of stuff is out of bounds, even though it's all being generated by people who are paid by the public and who are acting supposedly on behalf of the public. Thousands and thousands of civil servants are paid in effect to create knowledge. One thing I think is important to understand about the laws governing freedom of information, how they're being used, is that it's not just about raw data. It's about the preparation of knowledge, the development of knowledge, the way governments work, as demonstrated in the kind of knowledge that they produce on our behalf. I'm going to condense what I have about the history of access to information a fair amount, because I want to get fairly quickly to some of the things that are really on the table, I think, today, is in terms of where we should be trying to enforce, or where we should be trying to strengthen our access to information and what we can do in that regard. Access to information is a part of democratic theory, always has been. The need for debate, free and open debate on the direction of society is considered to be a keystone, a cornerstone of democracy since really since the concept of democracy was developed at all. Secrecy poses a threat to the continued consent of the government, and you can't have a sustainable political system without that. Access to information is also, we believe, and particularly the organization that I'm active in, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, we've tried to elaborate some thought on this topic, the link between access to information and the right to freedom of expression. International human rights documents talk about a right to seek and impart and receive information, which some people call a right to know. The idea here is you can't really exercise your right to free expression unless you're free to gather knowledge. A person confined to a solitary prison cell with no visitors and no access to media or reading material might be capable in theory of formulating, expressing profound thought and vision, but only with a very seriously limited creative palette. If human expression is going to flourish, it requires broad access to the world and to its phenomena and its knowledge. And therefore, to properly enable freedom of expression, you need access to information held by public entities. They're the largest, if not the largest, collectors of information. One of the most common ways in which people disseminate or exercise their right to freedom of expression is by disseminating information and opinion about politics and public policy. That kind of discourse is pretty seriously weakened if they're deprived of the knowledge that nourishes it. The state also is uniquely positioned to impose arbitrary limits on freedom of expression by virtue of its monopoly on the lawful use of force and its control of the legal system. Therefore, the potential for the abuse of power exists, and it's curbed significantly if constitutional guarantees about access to information are in place. And so for this reason, governments responding to the demands of their citizens have, one by one, tended to pass freedom of information legislation and institute this kind of access regime. The first one, believe it or not, was Sweden, way back in 1766. It was 200 years before the next country introduced a freedom of information regime. That was the U.S., 1966. Anybody know what the first Canadian jurisdiction to pass an access to information law was?
Okay.
Nope. It was actually Nova Scotia in 1977. And the Federal Access to Information Act was proclaimed in 1983, and at that time, Canada was just the 13th country in the world with national legislation. Well, things have progressed since then, and there are now about 140 countries that have some form of access regime. All 13 provinces and territories in Canada, as well as many municipalities, of course the federal government, have access legislation. Some laws cover not only government departments, but also autonomous public institutions, such as in Ontario, universities and hospitals. An important point, though, about these Canadian laws, particularly versus those in the U.S., which we also hear a lot about, is that basically, because of the differences in our constitutional framework, in the U.S., the default is openness. In Canada, the default is secrecy. We also, and therefore the onus is on the state in the U.S., broadly speaking, to show why something should be kept under wraps. Here it's on the citizen to show why it should be released. We also have this notion of Crown copyright, that the Crown actually has a creative rights interest in everything that's produced by civil servants. And we also have the notion of cabinet secrecy, which is also, as we'll see later on, a factor. However, in theory, and sometimes in practice, the scope of records that can be subject to access to information or freedom of information requests is vast. I should point out, by the way, we use both terms because the laws, some laws are called Access to Information Act, such as the federal law. Many of the provincial laws, but not all of them, are called Freedom of Information Acts or legislation. Citizens can request documents relating to their own personal lives, arising out of their own contact with government departments, records of the design and implementation and outcomes and evaluation of government programs are covered, correspondence among government officials, briefing notes to ministers, and so on. And every year, thousands of record requests are filed and thousands of pages of documents released. You'll be learning, if you attend the next workshop, about the technical details of how to file requests. I'm certainly not an expert on that. I haven't done it for a long time. But basically, you fill out a form, you pay a small fee, the government entity, or whatever it is, has a certain amount of time to respond. They can say it's too vague. They can say it will take more time to search for the records. They can say the material is exempted and there are exemptions that you can drive a truck through. They can say it doesn't exist. They're not supposed to lie, but we have some evidence that they sometimes don't take the pains that they should take to discover documents, or increasingly, unfortunately, that in fact they go to great lengths to not create documents in the first place, precisely because they don't ever want a record of whatever it is being done or deliberated to exist that might be subject to an access request. Now, of course, journalists and news organizations are quick to realize the potential value of access requests, and many, many fantastic stories and government moving stories have been written. Somalia, 1993 was one of them, the sponsorship scandal that engulfed the Liberal government in the 1990s and early years of the last decade. Racial profiling by police here in Toronto, the robocalls scandal during the last election. Rob Ford's official agenda has been, the Toronto Star has used municipal access to information legislation to get what it can about Ford's agenda, or more commonly the fact that there's nothing in the agenda, and many, many more. And one of the reasons we go for these documents is because the same reason why historians go for documents, trust documents over oral testimony. Unlike human sources, as Cecil Rosner said in his History of Investigative Journalism in Canada, official documents rarely lie or change their minds. The annual conventions of the Canadian Union Association of Journalists, they regularly do workshops on techniques and so on. So there's no doubt that this legislation has worked. It has helped not only journalists, but many other people. It's also used by corporations, it's used by political activists, by political parties, and so on. And not just the major media. This is a story about the robocalls, story about how the two reporters that broke that one was basically like a kind of street shoe leather reporter, and the other was a data expert. This is the Waterloo Region Record, story about how they used the access to information legislation in their own municipality and how long it took them. The municipality dragged their feet incredibly on this particular request. And however, of course, governments react and try to, they realize the potential for embarrassment, and they try to thwart the attempts of reporters and others to uncover what's going on. This is just a point form list of some of the things that happen: exorbitant fees, long delays, as I said, claiming that something is subject to cabinet secrecy because the topic was discussed at cabinet, singling out particular people for particularly, they kind of red circle certain requests from certain people and give them particular attention, which slows the progress of the request through the pipeline. And this, of course, is often a broader policy, part of the broader policy of restricting access, micromanaging media relations, muzzling whistleblowers, and so on. And we've seen a lot of this kind of thing and a growing amount of it in recent years. It took the Privy Council Office 4 years to respond to an Ottawa citizen request for information on a 2006 junket to Edmonton in a Challenger jet for the Prime Minister and 6 colleagues to watch Game 6 of the Stanley Cup, for example. In April 2010, a reporter for the Winnipeg Free Press, Mary Agnes Welch, she filed an FOI request asking for a study by the Public Health Agency of Canada of the link between poor water quality and a deadly flu outbreak at the St. Teresa Point First Nation in northern Manitoba. It took 18 months a complaint to the Federal Information Commissioner's Office to get Health Canada to surrender this document. And despite the fact that there were extensive blacked out passages, the conclusions were so disturbing that the newspaper was able to make this story the top story in its edition back in December 2011. Even then, Health Canada refused to allow the author of the study to be interviewed. It's not just not releasing the documents, it's trying to restrict access to the people who developed, once again, this kind of knowledge, once again, at public expense and supposedly on the public's behalf. All kinds of other examples we could talk about, and the information commissioners, both federal and provincial, are becoming increasingly vocal about this kind of thing. The outgoing Alberta commissioner warned that there were becoming so many legislative exemptions that the province's law looked like it was going to become what he described as a piece of Swiss cheese. There were other similar concerns. This is the Quebec commissioner who talks about the behavior of public bodies and how cautious they are, and there's a culture of secrecy. And again, Suzanne Legault talking about skewing all decision-making toward greater protection, greater circling of the wagons. I'm going to skip over some of the, there are just all kinds of examples and studies and so on that have been done about how much control is being exercised. But they're certainly there for anybody who wants to look at them. In 2011, the Associated Press News Agency looked worldwide, did a comparative study worldwide of national freedom of information regimes. They asked two very simple things. They requested data on terrorism arrests and convictions in 105 countries. Canada, to compile this information, asked for a 200-day extension. Turkey supplied the information in 7 days, India within a month, and Mexico within 2 months. A lot of evidence that not only are we deteriorating by our own standards, but we're also slipping by international standards. Now, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression did a report earlier this year for the 30th anniversary review that the Federal Information Commissioner is conducting. We did a survey, and this was a submission to that review process. We did a survey of Canadians showing, not surprisingly, pretty great demand for better access to information legislation, more functional, and so on. We found also that 22% of exemptions invoked on a government-wide basis cite international affairs and defense as reasons for refusing to release information, clearly taking advantage of the post-2001 environment and guessing that those kinds of arguments will have more traction than they would have in previous decades. People talked about lengthy wait times as being a deterrent to actually even getting involved in the access to information system. Too many exemptions to the Act. You get to a certain point and people say, well, that's exempt, so you've wasted your time even filing the request. And of course the fees. And they charge not only fees for filing requests, but photocopying fees, exorbitant photocopying fees. You can appeal those, but it's, again, a lengthy process with no guarantee of success. So that's the Information Commissioner's homepage with some information about the 30th anniversary review. Now, in response to this, you may have heard of the federal government's so-called Open Data Initiative. And in fact, because there has been a growing course of criticism, The Treasury Board Secretary Tony Clement in recent years has created something called the Open Government or Open Data Initiative. They've created a portal where they put a lot of information up there, government information. They make it available. There is a place here, I think it's, yeah, right on that link there, and then this is the actual slide, where they actually are now posting documents that are released in response to access to information requests. You'll notice one thing that isn't on this page anywhere, and that is a link to the Federal Information Commissioner's Office. I think there's a very clear attempt by the government to sidetrack the Information Commissioner, whose powers are limited, but who at least has some power to investigate, and who also is really the person in the federal bureaucracy with a degree of independence that allows her to make statements about, to ride herd on the process and make statements about when it's being followed properly and how to use it. You won't see a link to her office there, and I think that's very significant. You'll also note, I think, that while under pressure, there certainly is an attempt to create an organized portal and repository for information that the government aims to make public. It's what we would call a push initiative rather than a pull initiative, in the sense that they put up here what they want to put up. They don't, there's no mechanism for people saying, well, actually, this is what I would like to see. You get what Tony Clement and the rest of the cabinet wants you to see. So we're basically in a situation where we have legislation, we claim to have an access to information regime in this country, but it's not functioning very well. One of the reasons it isn't functioning very well is because there's no will to make it function well. And the second is because the legislative framework really is clear. What do we do about all this? I think number one is we try to use the laws. We try to use what's there. And in fact, I'm happy to be able to report that while the use of access to information legislation and the procedures by journalists was declining for quite a while because so many of them were finding it so frustrating, there's actually now, we've kind of come out of the trough and people are starting to use it more. And you'll see some very tenacious people, particularly as you point to the Ottawa Bureau of the Canadian Press, the news agency, which files on average about one Freedom of Information request every single day. They've always got tons of these things going on in the pipeline. They don't all produce interesting material, but a lot of them do. And once you get that kind of system going, regularly it generates a whole lot of pretty interesting stories. Also, some of the information commissioners and the access to information coordinators in government departments, which every department has to have one. Some of them are people of goodwill who can be worked with. And it's important to say, to remember that, as the CBC journalist Linda McIntyre said not too long ago, you have to take ownership of the things that you're free to do. It's kind of a use it or lose it proposition. But then, of course, there's advocacy. Advocacy for, I think, on three levels. One is bureaucratic reforms, get people to do what they're supposed to do. Second is legislative, and the third is kind of on a constitutional level. On the lowest level, we need action on fees. It needs to not be so expensive to use this process. Economic resources, lack of resources cannot be a barrier to access. To accessing the system. This is supposed to be a citizen's right, like other citizens' rights shouldn't be subject to whether you have the resources to do it or not. So costs, definitely. We also need to push on response time. We need to force people to adhere to what they are supposed to adhere to in terms of response times. What the Information Commissioner said about the RCMP is absolutely outrageous, that they could simply ignore requests for as long as they appear to be doing. Governments need also to overhaul their management of information. They need better standards, better systems for retention and storage, which in turn, I mean, simply for their own functioning, simply to be able to function properly. A lot of the time these delays are because they can't find the stuff because their own record keeping is in such disarray. So, you know, standards in this regard would make it easier for them to not only make it easier to release it routinely to the public, but make it easier to do their jobs. Again, and I have to keep insisting on this, which we are paying them to do, on our behalf, in our interest. I mean, sometimes data is supplied as sort of unreadable image files, on paper printouts, still in formats that can't be manipulated, can't be repurposed in any way at all. So, and of course, you know, the current access system was designed before the advent of the internet, social media, digital technology. Really, the whole system has to be brought into the 21st century. Now, they have made it, one victory is that they have made it possible to apply, to file access requests online. So that is a kind of victory, but you know, in the grand scheme of things, I would argue fairly small. Legislative advocacy. The basic idea here is that government, its agencies, and its employees have a duty to create records. And they have to not only be held to that standard, they also have to, in my view, really expand the amount of their commitment to actually releasing stuff as opposed to the instinctive response being a knee-jerk attempt to find a reason why it shouldn't be released. Former Information Commissioner John Reed in 2008 in his proposed amendments basically said the right of access to information is not meaningful if records aren't routinely created in the first place. So it needs to be embedded, as we said in our CJFE recommendations, embedded into the design of public programs from the outset. We need to clarify who can use it. At the moment, it's only Canadian citizens, permanent residents, individuals, and incorporated entities present in Canada. This is not what the spirit of universal human rights legislation is. It's supposed to be available to anyone. And in fact, Canadians can request information in other jurisdictions, such as the United States. There are a huge number of institutions exempt: the federal courts, Parliament, many crown corporations, and so on. Airport authorities, for example, are not subject to access to information legislation. Olympic organizing committees, another example. The House of Commons itself, the Senate, expense legislation, expense reports, a rather hot topic these days, would not be subject to access to information legislation. Now, obviously, some limitations need to be there. There are some privacy concerns. There are cases in which the public interest, the harm that would be caused by releasing information is greater than the good that would be caused by the same thing. But we think that there should be some pretty rigorous tests applied and pretty consistent principled tests applied instead of so much of the ad hoc decision making that goes on at the moment. Same with cabinet confidences. There's no reason why, and just the fact that something is before the cabinet should, in and of itself, enable it to be exempt. Another thing that is really deficient in the federal legislation, and fixed in some provincial levels, is that the Information Commissioner does not have the power to order the release of information. She can issue a report saying the law has not been followed, but she doesn't have the quasi-judicial power to say, you screwed up, now you have to release it. She can report, and it would be then up to the legislature or parliament, possibly because of public pressure, to order that release, but she can't make an order herself. The same is true of penalties for people who don't fulfill their rights, their obligations under the legislation. There's very little sanction that can be opposed. These are all things that could be fixed in legislative reform, such as, which I think we all hope there's a chance that it might follow after the commissioner comes down with her recommendations in her 30-year review. And finally, on the constitutional level. This matter of the default being secrecy rather than disclosure, it really traces its roots to our constitutional, the origins of our country and its constitutional make as a British colony and then dominion, and our constitutional makeup. Very different from what you see in the United States, very different from the kind of Republican tradition, where the default is more that the people are sovereign rather than that the Crown grants rights on sufferance. And this, of course, as the constitutional experts, the CCLA will tell you, no doubt, in much greater detail than I can, a very daunting prospect to make this kind of fundamental constitutional change. However, many people believe that unless we can find some way to chip away at that idea that the default is secrecy rather than openness, it will be very difficult to have realistic, a realistically robust freedom of information regime in this country. In terms of organization around advocacy, there are some really positive signs. There are open data initiatives in many municipalities, people demanding that the municipalities at least put as much data as possible generated at the municipal level online, make it available, and so on. They're still unilaterally selected by officials, but an awful lot of information has been released in this way. Beyond that, people have started to call for what I would call a coordinated citizens pro-access initiative. Dean Beebe, who's the Assistant Bureau Chief, Deputy Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press in Ottawa, a real expert at this kind of thing, has called for the formation of a broad coalition to push for access to information reform. And Alistair Roberts, who's one of the leading academic analysts, has said governments will not take action until citizens organize to exert pressure on them through watchdog organizations. Some of the information commissioners have said the same thing. The guy in Saskatchewan, Gary Dixon, who's one of the more activist information commissioners at the provincial level, who says, without sustained public pressure, the goal of achieving greater public transparency and accountability may be exceedingly difficult to achieve. Now, there are some organizations that have begun efforts in this area. The advocacy group Democracy Watch has spearheaded an open government coalition. Part of their aims is reform of the Federal Act. Openmedia.ca, formerly the Campaign for Democratic Media, access to information improvement is also one of its goals. And of course, internationally, we have things like the International Modern Media Initiative, which was spearheaded by the government of Iceland, where they seek to give their country the best what they describe as the best transparency enabling legislation, create a stronghold for investigative journalism, internet publishers, transparency watchdogs, and the public. I think also we need a national portal for users of access to information legislation, a place where best practices can be shared, basic documents on how to use the legislation can be posted, an education section containing guides to request making, resources section containing information about existing data sets, news and events disseminating information about developments in the FOI world, and so on. Also with, of course, RSS and social media components. And I also have started to think about the possibility of something called, what I call the FOI pledge, which would be something that news organizations and public interest organizations could sign on to, basically saying that they are willing to make a sustained commitment to using and practicing and promoting freedom of information as a reporting tool and as a public interest and advocacy tool. In practice, people do, but in a lot of anecdotal reports we have suggest that people are weary of dealing with the hassles and expense. Individuals, particularly individual reporters in news organizations, they feel it's not necessarily beneficial to their careers and so on. And the idea would be that you ask organizations to commit to some kind of level of activity in this area, certain level of targets for numbers of requests, targets for numbers of published or broadcast stories, pledge to cover it as a pledge for organizations that aren't primarily news organizations to do other things in terms of publicity, to hold events, to prepare briefs and so on, so that it gets baked into the goals and the mandate and the day-to-day, month-to-month activities of whatever organization it is we're talking about. Those are the kind of things that I think we're going to have to start looking at in terms of trying to be systematic about pushing for the kinds of reforms we need, supporting the people inside the bureaucracies, inside the governments who are in favor of much better access to information legislation and more robust access regimes. And finally, I just want to leave you with the idea, come back to the idea that, again, too often I think these debates are carried on as if we were asking for something that was kind of an incremental, there would be an incremental cost to, either in terms of resources or in terms of power exercised by governments and politicians. It's not that. I mean, it seems to be such a difficult concept to get people's heads around, the idea that we pay these people to go out and do this, to collect information, and then we have to get down on our hands and knees to beg for it to be released to us. We pay these people to develop policy, and then we have to get down on our hands and knees and beg them to let us in on the decision-making process that went into making policy. Beg them to tell us what alternatives were rejected. Beg them to tell us what the rationale was for deciding to come down on whatever particular side they came down on. When you look at it that way, it just seems to be very, very simple to argue for a default that is openness rather than a default in secrecy. Hopefully, if more and more of us can get that message out, it'll become easier to make progress in legislative and possibly even more far-reaching reforms. I got a couple of other slides here. I mainly wanted to leave you with some things, and I actually have a few pages printed off here if anybody wants them. There are some great resources in terms of books about access to information legislation. This guy, Alistair Roberts, he's Canadian. He now teaches in the States. He's one of the world's foremost experts on access to information legislation. This is a fantastic summary. It was published in, I think, 2007. So it's post-2001, which is important. This is a collection of essays, a Canadian collection of essays, quite theoretical. That looks at access to information in a broader context. I've got some, you don't have to worry about trying to copy all this down because I've got some sheets here with these references on. This is a history of investigative journalism in Canada by Cecil Rosner, who works for the CBC in Winnipeg. It's got quite an interesting history of how journalists, investigative journalists, have used access to information legislation. This is the standard text now for that we use in journalism schools for media law, for specifically from a practical journalist perspective. Again, good section on that access to information. And finally, this book by four of Canada's most foremost investigative journalists, great handbook to doing this kind of reporting. And it has, once again, an extensive section on using access legislation. So I hope that's given you some food for thought. They say I've got some reference sheets here. If anybody wants some of those, the full citations for those books. And I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much for listening.